Remember when Elizabeth Taylor slept with her co-star Richard Burton while married to Eddie Fisher and it was so scandalous that the Vatican wrote an open letter about it? I don't because I wasn't alive yet, so let's talk about it. The first time that Richard Burton saw Elizabeth Taylor, it was 1953. They were attending a Hollywood party at the home of Gene Simmons, no, not that one, this one, and Stuart Granger. Richard had written in his diary that Liz was so extraordinarily beautiful that he nearly laughed out loud. Liz, on the other hand, thought Richard was swaggering and vulgar and opted to ignore him. 9 years later, when she found out that he was to be her co-star on Cleopatra, she vowed to not be another notch on his belt. On January 22nd, 1962, they showed up on set in full costume, and Richard said, "Has anybody ever told you you're a very pretty girl?" Only in a Welsh accent. Here's the great lover, the great wit, the great intellectual of Wales, and he comes out with a line like that? Liz would later joke to her friends. But in truth, that first day was the day that Liz would fall for her co-star. Richard showed up hungover and Liz had to hold his cup of coffee for him. As he sipped from the cup she held in her hands, Liz stared into his eyes, and it was then that Liz fell for Richard's vulnerability. Dick was a goner too, he later said. She was like a mirage of beauty of the ages, irresistible like the pull of gravity. That magnetic pull only intensified when they shared their first kiss in Cleopatra's bedroom. The scene was repeated several times, with the kisses dragging on longer and longer with each passing take. They even continued past the director's call to print it. What an endearing tale of love until you remember that Liz and Richard were both married. Liz's husband Eddie had followed her to Rome where Cleopatra was being shot. Eventually, the pair's flirtation was so obvious and embarrassing for Eddie that he eventually stopped showing up to set. Meanwhile, Richard's wife Sybil, with whom he shared 2 daughters, paid no mind to the affair, thinking that it would be no different than Richard's previous dalliances. Tales of le scandale, as Richard liked to call it, eventually left the sets of Cleopatra and made their way to the Vatican, resulting in an open letter that was printed in the Vatican City's weekly newspaper. The letter charged Elizabeth with erotic vagrancy due to the fact that she was mucking about with Richard whilst married to Eddie. Apparently, Richard's marriage wasn't as big of an issue for them. Eventually, news of the affair reached the rest of the world, and their spouses felt the impact of it. Not that we really care about how anything impacted Eddie Fisher. The two were so brash about their affair that one day Eddie called his house and Richard answered the phone. "What are you doing in my house?" Eddie asked. "What do you think I'm doing?" Richard answered. "I'm diddling your wife." He didn't say diddle, though. He said a different word that starts with an F and rhymes with mucking. Their affair would drive Eddie to overdose, and rumors swirled that Sybil attempted to take her own life. Liz herself made 2 attempts on her own life during the filming of Cleopatra, one of which was in front of Richard. Liz's marriage to Eddie was so strained that she woke up one night to Eddie pointing a weapon at her head and said, "Don't worry, Elizabeth. I'm not going to kill you. You're too beautiful." Liz and Richard hid out in a rented villa from paparazzi and fans. Richard and Sybil divorced in 1963, and Liz's divorce to Eddie was finalized on March 6, 1964. 9 days later, Liz and Dick married in a private ceremony at the Ritz-Carlton in Montreal, Quebec on March 15th. 38-year-old Richard was Liz's 5th husband, and 32-year-old Liz was Richard's 2nd wife. They stayed up until 7 a.m. the next morning talking and laughing. "I'm so happy, you can't believe it," Liz exclaimed. The Burtons were a powerhouse, making millions and spending the same. After flying to Paris, Richard bought a $960,000 jet. Just 'cause. They owned art, and not the kind that you get from HomeSense or IKEA. I'm talking Picasso, Monet, Degas, Renoir, all of it. The whole gambit. And then there were the jewels. This La Peregrina necklace from the 16th century, which had been previously owned by Mary Tudor and the Bonapartes, which she had found one of their Pekingese puppies chewing on. Then there's the infamous 33.19 carat Krupp diamond, and not to mention a lot of Bulgari. Richard had said that he introduced Elizabeth to beer and she introduced him to Bulgari. Bulgari. He also said that it was the only word she knew in Italian. They spent their marriage hobnobbing their way through Europe, hanging out with Liz's old MGM friend, Princess Grace of Monaco, and having dinner with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The Burtons were much too notorious for the commoners of Hollywood, you know. Part of their notoriety was their penchant for fighting, both publicly and privately. Elizabeth had said, "Our fights are delightful, screaming matches, and Richard is rather like a small atom bomb going off." Cute. So famous were these fights that people would pay to have their room near the Burtons so that they could eavesdrop on the feuding couple. But as their marriage went on, the fighting went from performative to serious. Richard's alcoholism and Liz's addiction to pills left nothing but carnage in their wake, solidifying their nickname, the Battling Burtons. Years of jealousy were taking their toll on the couple. In 1966, Liz had won an Oscar for her role in their movie, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, while Richard did not. Maybe I'm jealous of her power or something, I don't know, he said. Unsurprisingly, Richard couldn't keep it in his pants and in 1972 had an affair with his co-star Natalie Dellen while filming their movie Bluebeard. He had spent years promising Liz that he would never betray her, but he did. And she made him sweat for several days before taking him back. Yes, that's right. Several whole days. But then on July 4th, 1973, Liz announced, I am convinced it would be a good and constructive idea if Richard and I separated for a while. Maybe we loved each other too much. I never believed such a thing was possible. Richard made an attempt to save his marriage by seeking help to detox from alcohol, but his efforts did not seem to work. And 1 month after their 10-year anniversary, the couple announced they would be getting a divorce. But if you know Liz's story, then you also know that this was not the end for Liz and Dick.